today sort of take a similar tack with the apology that I used in the spring with the American documents, and look at the apology as a document that comes down to us and is important in shaping our understanding of an important historical figure in ways that are meaningful in the ways that we live our lives. As anybody who has read a few of Plato's dialogues will know, it is generally quite hard to figure out Socrates' position on any particular subject. After all, Socrates' famous method is much more about asking questions and demolishing other people's positions than about claiming anything positive himself. Moreover, understanding Socrates is made harder because most of what we hear about him comes through the pen of Plato, who clearly had thoughts of his own. And yet, for all these difficulties, one still wants to know, who the hell was Socrates, and what did he think he was up to? It turns out that Plato's Apology is a good place to begin answering these questions, because it is one of the few places where Socrates actually says anything substantive about himself and his own beliefs. So I'd like to start today's talk by reviewing these beliefs, supplementing them as necessary, with a few peeks into some of the other dialogues. But Plato is not the only source we have about Socrates. And so after looking at the Apology, I'd like to review what we can learn from some of these other sources. And then, finally, by comparing and contrasting these various bits of information, I will try to answer both this original question about Socrates and a similar one about Plato. Who the hell did he think he was, and what was he up to? Socrates' defense, as portrayed by Plato, consists of an introduction, 3 main parts, and 2 little codas. Of the 3 main parts, Socrates' defense against the formal charges brought by Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon is contained in the second, rather small part. Here, after recounting the charges against him of corrupting the minds of the young and of believing in deities of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state, Socrates begins his defense on the theory that the best defense is a good offense. And he goes ahead to prosecute his prosecutors. Using his fairly typical question and answer method, Socrates attempts to show fairly quickly that his accusers have no knowledge about the proper training of youth or about Socrates' belief in gods, and thus they have no real standing to charge him of anything. In short, he says, Meletus, representing his attackers, is guilty of treating a serious matter with levity, since he summons people to stand their trial on frivolous grounds, and professes concern and keen anxiety in matters about which he has never had the slightest interest. The impropriety of self-confident youngsters bringing charges against their elders and betters is also a theme in the Erythro, which is said as taking place just prior to Socrates' defense. In this dialogue, Socrates converses with Euthyphro, who believes himself to be a very pious, devout man, and who is charging his own father for the accidental death of a hireling who himself had murdered another servant. Through a series of moves, Plato establishes 2 analogies. First, that Euthyphro's prosecution of his old father is like Meletus's prosecution of old Socrates. And second, that Euthyphro is a typical Athenian. Then, through his usual method, Socrates leads Euthyphro around in circles in a discussion of piety and holiness, something I'll come back to in a minute. For now, though, suffice it to say that by the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro is completely bewildered and retreats to a dogmatic statement of piety. He says, "If anyone knows how to say and do things pleasing to the gods in prayer and sacrifice, that is holiness. And such behavior saves the family and private life, together with the common interests of the state. To do the opposite of things pleasing to the gods is impious, and this it is that upsets all and ruins everything." Socrates, and we readers, on the other hand, know full well that such a statement is wholly inadequate and that Euthyphro has no true knowledge of holiness or piety. And thus the dialogue concludes with Socrates ironically claiming that he must not have understood Euthyphro, because if you did not know precisely what is holy and unholy, it is unthinkable that for a simple hireling you ever would have moved to prosecute your aged sire on a charge of murder. No, you would have feared to risk the wrath of the gods on the chance that you were not doing right, and would have been afraid of the talk of men. The implications for Socrates' own trial are clear. The notions of virtue, holiness, and piety, held both by Socrates' accuser in particular and Athenians in general, were severely flawed. And if they realized how flawed they were, they would hesitate from prosecuting and convicting Socrates for fear of the wrath of the gods and the talk of men. But of course, as we shall hear again and again, they did not realize how ignorant they were. The bulk of the apology, then, surrounding the defense of the formal charges, is taken up with Socrates' defense of his life work in Athens. In the first part, Socrates characterizes popular opinion about him as if they were charges. He says, "Let us go back to the beginning and consider what the charge is that has made me so unpopular, and has encouraged Meletus to draw up this indictment. Very well, what did my critics say in attacking my character? I must read out their affidavits, so to speak, as though they were my legal accusers. Socrates is guilty of criminal meddling, in that he inquires into things below the earth and in the sky, and makes the weaker argument defeat the stronger, and teaches others to follow his example." Socrates then deals with each of these charges in turn. To the first charge, that he meddles in the things in the earth and the sky, he says that this notion is due to Aristophanes' portrayal of him in the clouds, and is simply false, and that no one can prove otherwise. In defending himself against the second charge, of making the weaker argument defeat the stronger, Socrates insists that this results from a popular misunderstanding of what he does. Socrates therefore goes on to characterize what he does do and why. According to him, following the revelation of the Delphic oracle that no one was wiser than Socrates, Socrates began making the rounds, talking to all the purportedly wise people he could find. In each case, Socrates came to the conclusion that the person was in fact not wise, and when he, Socrates, tried to convince his interlocutor that he was not wise, the man inevitably became resentful. And thus Socrates concludes that the oracle is correct, for, he says, in any particular case, well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is only too likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of. But he thinks that he knows something which he does not know, whereas I am quite conscious of my ignorance. At any rate, it seems that I am wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not know what I do not know. Socrates dispatches of the third charge by saying, having observed him at work, young men often take me as their model and go on to try to question other persons. Whereupon, I suppose, they find an unlimited number of people who think that they know something, but really know little or nothing. Consequently, their victims become annoyed not with themselves, but with me. And they complain that there is a pestilential busybody called Socrates, who fills young people's heads with wrong ideas. In short, in trying to correct popular opinion about himself, Socrates has begun to characterize his life in no uncertain terms. He is unpopular, certainly, but it is an unpopularity born of trying to show his fellow Athenians a particularly unpleasant truth, that no one really seems to know anything about anything. And it is an unpopularity that Socrates is willing to bear because his task is not his own doing. Rather, it is a mission from God. Socrates returns to and elaborates these themes following his defense of Meletus' formal charges. With respect to his mission, Socrates claims, God appointed me, as I supposed and believed, to the duty of leading the philosophical life, examining myself and others. Such a statement may seem paradoxical to modern minds, accustomed to thinking of philosophy as something independent of, if not antithetical to, religion. But to Socrates and his contemporaries, it need not have been. Rather, as Socrates goes on, says, philosophy is a duty I have accepted, as I said, in obedience to God's commands, given in oracles and dreams and in every other way that any other divine dispensation has ever impressed a duty upon man. In particular, Socrates understands this duty as including the interrogation of the citizens of Athens. He goes on to say, the truth of the matter, gentlemen, is pretty certainly this, that real wisdom is the property of God, and this oracle is his way of telling us that human wisdom has little or no value. It seems to me that he is not referring literally to Socrates, but has merely taken my name as an example, as if he would say to us, the wisest among you men is he who has realized, like Socrates, that in respect of wisdom, he is really worthless. This is why I still go about seeking and searching in obedience to the divine command. If I think that anyone is wise, whether citizen or stranger, and when I think any person is not wise, I try to help the cause of God by proving that he is not. This occupation has kept me too busy to do much either in politics or in my own affairs. In fact, my service to God has reduced me to extreme poverty. Not only does Socrates see himself as serving God, but also as serving his fellows. Indeed, he says, it is my belief that no greater good has ever befallen you in this city than my service to my God. For I spend all my time going about trying to persuade you, young and old, to make your first and chief concern not for your bodies nor for your possessions, but for the highest welfare of your souls, proclaiming as I go, wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth and every other blessing, both to the individual and to the state. Thus, he says, so far from pleading on my own behalf as might be supposed, I am really pleading for yours, to save you from misusing the gift of God by condemning me. If you put me to death, you will not easily find anyone to take my place. It is literally true, even if it sounds rather comical, that God has specially appointed me to this city, as though it were a large thoroughbred horse, which because of its great size is inclined to be lazy and needs the stimulation of some stinging fly. It seems to me that God has attached me to this city to perform the office of such a fly, and all day long I never cease to settle here, there, and everywhere, rousing, persuading, reproving every one of you. You will not easily find another like me, gentlemen, and if you take my advice, you will spare my life. I suspect, however, that before long you will awake from your drowsing, and in your annoyance you will take Anytus' advice and finish me off with a single slap. And then you will go on sleeping till the end of your days, unless God in his care for you sends someone to take my place. If you doubt whether I am really the sort of person who would have been sent to this city as a gift from God, you can convince yourself by looking at it this way. Does it seem natural that I should have neglected my own affairs and endured the humiliation of allowing my family to be neglected for all these years, while I busied myself all the time on your behalf, going like a father or an elder brother to see each one of you privately and urging you to set your thoughts on goodness? And finally, after his conviction by the jury, when Socrates is asked to propose a sentence fitting for his crime, he says, instead of taking a course which would have done no good either to you or me, I set myself to do you individually and private what I hold to be the greatest possible service. I tried to persuade each one of you not to think more of practical advantages than of his mental and moral well-being, or in general to think more of advantage than of well-being in the case of the state or anything else. What do I deserve for behaving this way? Some reward, gentlemen, if I am bound to suggest what I really deserve, and what is more, a reward which would be appropriate for myself. Well, what is appropriate for a poor man who is a public benefactor and who requires leisure for giving you moral encouragement? Nothing could be more appropriate for such a person than free maintenance at the state's expense. He deserves it much more than any victor in the races at Olympia. These people give you the semblance of success, but I give you the reality. They do not need maintenance, but I do. So if I am to suggest an appropriate penalty which is strictly in accord with justice, I suggest free maintenance by the state. Now, these parts of Socrates' defense have been interpreted in many ways. They strike many readers, for instance, as arrogant, and make them hold a lower opinion of Socrates rather than a higher one. Some people feel Socrates is just being Socrates and couldn't help it. He just couldn't be any other way. Some people feel that Socrates was intentionally trying to antagonize the jury. I.F. Stone, for example, in his book, The Trial of Socrates, suggests that Socrates wanted to be found guilty and executed, so that on the one hand, Socrates' fame would be established through his martyrdom, while on the other, simultaneously proving Socrates' often made point about the stupidity of mass opinion. But I would like to suggest that these characterizations of Socrates' life be taken at face value. They amount to the outlines of a creed, a deeply held set of convictions that developed over the course of Socrates' life and the course of the lives of the young men who gathered around him. I'd like now to try to outline some of the elements of this creed. I realize at this point it's sort of a tentative and speculative endeavor, but I think it can be enlightening nonetheless. During the course of the Phaedo, which recounts Socrates' final moments in death, Socrates remembers his intellectual development in the following way. As a young man, he says, he had an extraordinary passion for the natural sciences, because he thought it would be marvelous to know the causes for which each thing comes and ceases and continues to be. As he pursued his studies, however, he could not find any explanations that satisfied him. At last, he said, I came to the conclusion that I was uniquely unfitted for this form of inquiry. Indeed, I unlearned even what I thought I had known, especially about the cause of growth in human beings. In other words, Socrates himself was the first victim of Socrates. He was the first one who thought he could know something and then realized he was just reduced to bewilderment and knew nothing at all. Regardless of whether this account is accurate, and there are reasons for thinking it is not, the point I'd like to draw for it is that at a very early age, Socrates became interested in certainty, which he considered to be the hallmark of true knowledge. And that also at this very early age, he found that he himself could not really be certain of anything. From here, we have little indication about how he developed until the incident of the oracle. As I've already mentioned, the oracle's reply to Chaerephon's question, if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, led Socrates to begin questioning people around him. It seems then that prior to the oracle, Socrates pretty much kept to himself, while after the oracle, Socrates spent most of his time questioning others. Indeed, one could imagine that Socrates spent his early years wrestling with the fact that he himself could never be certain about anything, and then began to wonder if this was a fact about him in particular or about humans in general. Anyway, we have seen that following his investigations around Athens, Socrates concludes the latter, and further concludes that real wisdom, i.e. certain knowledge, is the province of God. If this is so, then it follows that all that humans can do is to attempt to approach certain knowledge, even though there's no possibility of them finally attaining it. And yet, one who pursues wisdom pursues the divine, which is a worthy endeavor for humans. And this is what the lovers of wisdom, the philosophers, do. Now, such a pursuit of divine wisdom might not in and of itself be enough to make one consider Socrates and those like him to be religious, in the full sense of the word. After all, had Socrates continued to pursue knowledge in the natural science, he would have been little different from what modern scientists are today, who don't seem particularly religious necessarily. But Socrates did not pursue that kind of knowledge. Rather, as we find throughout the dialogues, Socrates was obsessed with developing certain knowledge about proper human behavior, of the good, of virtue. Indeed, for Socrates, virtue is knowledge. Moreover, as he's demonstrated, this knowledge is not knowledge of the gods, but the knowledge of justice. And it is here that Socratic philosophy becomes a truly religious enterprise. As James Beckman says, real holiness or real piety, Socrates implicitly argues, is justice. To seek justice is the way of true religious righteousness. But that is a perfect summary of the Socratic philosophical way. The Euthyphro says, in effect, that it was Socrates and not the practitioners and defenders of orthodoxy who was the true pious citizen. Thus, Socrates promotes piety by promoting justice, by promoting wisdom. And the first step in promoting wisdom, according to him, is promoting the twin realization that 1, humans are not wise, and 2, that wisdom is the true province of God. Thus, in the Theaetetus, Socrates compares himself to a midwife. He says, "My art of midwifery is in general like theirs," the true midwives. "The only difference is that my patients are men, not women, and my concern is not with the body, but with the soul that is in the travail of birth. And the highest point of my art is the power to prove by every test whether the offspring of a young man's thought is a false phantom or an instinct with life and truth. I am so far like the midwife that I cannot myself give birth to wisdom. And the common reproach is true, that though I question others, I can myself bring nothing to light because there is no wisdom in me. The reason is this: heaven constrains me to serve as a midwife, but has debarred me from giving birth. So of myself I have no sort of wisdom, nor has any discovery ever been born to me as the child of my soul. Those who frequent my company at first appear, some of them, quite unintelligent. But as we go further with our discussions, all who are favored by heaven make progress at a rate that seems surprising to others as well as to themselves, although it is clear that they have never learned anything from me. The many admirable truths they bring to birth have been discovered by themselves from within, but the delivery is heaven's work and mine." Such a mission is problematically related to public life. On the one hand, in the Apology, Socrates tells us that the promotion of justice is incompatible with the public life. Indeed, he cites 2 examples of his own public life, one with the democracy and another under the oligarchy of the 30, in both of which he attempted to promote justice or prevent injustice, and in both cases nearly at the cost of his life. Thus, he says, he has spent most of his life in private, since this would be most useful to him and the city. And yet, on the other hand, as Beckman says, the Gorgias shows that Socrates is the only true practitioner of the political art, which is defined as making citizens as good as possible. Or in Socrates' own words, "I think I am one of the very few Athenians, not to say the only one, engaged in the true political art, and that of men today, I alone practice statesmanship." Thus, while not operating through any public forum, Socrates' life and mission is a profoundly public and civic one. He helps Athenians to become better, and thus he can legitimately claim to be a great gift to the city from God, and that he should be subsidized rather than punished. Of course, a majority of the Athenians don't see it this way. That's why he's in court. And yet, Socrates gives us another characterization of his trial, sort of the device of foreshadowing in the dialogue of the Gorgias, where Socrates predicts that when he does come to trial, "My trial will be like that of a doctor prosecuted by a cook before a jury of children. Just consider what kind of defense such a man could offer in such a predicament, if the plaintiff should accuse him in these terms. Children of the jury, this fellow has done all of you abundant harm, and the youngest among you he is ruining by surgery and cautery, and he bewilders you by starving and choking you, giving you bitter draughts, and compelling you to hunger and thirst, whereas I used to feast you with plenty of sweetmeats of every kind. What do you think a doctor could find to say in such a desperate situation? If he spoke the truth and said, "All this I did, children, in the interests of health," what a shout do you think such a jury would utter? Would it not be a loud one? And of course, Socrates was convicted and executed. Thus, to return to my suggestion that we take Socrates' religious stance in the Apology seriously, we can see how, finally, in the words of Beckman, this theme, Socrates' religious vocation and duty to the god of Delphi, establishes the profound dramatic pathos of the dialogue. Socrates is being tried for impiety, yet it is precisely his complete dedication to his God, even to death, which has offended his accusers and brought him to trial. The deepest conflict is that between the religion of the polis and Socrates' own religion. The Apology, when taken together with the Euthyphro and the Gorgias, is intent on showing that Socrates is the only true pious citizen, the religious citizen par excellence, and that he is being tried precisely for this reason. The presentation is tragic in the sense that it is not designed as an argument of Socrates' innocence before the law, but that though he was legally an atheist, truly and actually, that is in terms of philosophical understanding of the matter, he was the furthest thing from it. He stands in judgment of the current orthodox interpretation of what constituted religion in the polis. In other words, the defense presented in the dialogue entitled Socrates' Defense is not intended to be primarily a presentation of Socrates' defense against the legal charges against him, but rather a presentation of a defense of Socrates' entire life as such, at least as Plato would have us see it. Now, Plato was not the only person to write an account of Socrates' defense, or the only person to write Socratic dialogues, or the only person to use Socrates as a literary character. Xenophon, for example, a contemporary of Plato's, also wrote an account of Socrates' defense, as well as a few Socratic dialogues. While there are certainly overlaps with Plato's portrayal of Socrates, the differences are instructive. First and foremost, Xenophon's Socrates was not that much different from the run-of-the-mill Athenian. As our own Ray Chachi has put it, Xenophon's portrait of Socrates is an image of a man that was easily identifiable and accessible to the ordinary man in 5th century Athens. Aside from Xenophon's Symposium, which shows Socrates at his least serious, his Socratic writings can be seen as an attempt to vindicate the charges made against Socrates by his accusers. Xenophon stresses again and again the practical good done by Socrates to those who came in contact with him. It is the portrait of a gentleman who wishes to make others gentlemen, to ensure the friendship of others, to produce good statesmen and citizens. For instance, in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Xenophon writes, "All who knew what manner of man Socrates was, and who seek after virtue, continue to this day to miss him beyond all others, as the chief of helpers in the quest for virtue. For myself, I have described him as he was, so religious that he did nothing without the counsel of the gods, so just that he did no injury, however small, to any man, but conferred the greatest benefits on all who dealt with him, so self-controlled that he never chose the pleasanter rather than the better course, so wise that he was unerring in his judgment of the better and the worse, and needed no counselor, but relied on himself for his knowledge of them. Masterly in expounding and defining such things, no less masterly in putting others to the test, and convincing them of error, and exhorting them to follow virtue and gentleness. To me, he seemed to be all that a truly good and happy man must be. But if there is any doubter, let him set the character of other men besides these things, and then let him judge. This Socrates is not on a religious mission. He does what he does because he's a good guy. Indeed, he's sort of a paragon of Athenianness. For instance, in Xenophon's Apology, he recounts the incident of the oracle this way. He has Socrates saying, "Once upon a time, when Chaerephon made inquiry at the Delphic oracle concerning me in the presence of many people, Apollo answered," and now this is different from the way we hear it in Plato, Apollo answered that no man was more free than I, or more just, or more prudent. Now Apollo did not compare me to a god. He did, however, judge that I far excelled the rest of mankind. Xenophon's dialogues show Socrates is just one of the guys. In the Symposium of Xenophon, for instance, Socrates is shown to have a lighter, less serious side, indeed more so than in anything we ever see in Plato. Or in Xenophon's Economicus, Socrates is shown discoursing on the practical subject of estate management, and in fact actually being more of a pupil than a teacher. A second difference between Plato's and Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates is stylistic. While it is often said that Plato's style is far superior to Xenophon's, what seems really important to me is that Xenophon's reminiscences are clearly portrayed as that, personal, subjective reminiscences of Socrates, while Plato's, on the other hand, are portrayed as objective accounts of an omniscient narrator. Thus, while Plato's Apology presents itself as a transcript of a portion of an actual trial, and thus objective, note, by the way, that Plato is mentioned in the Apology in the third person, as if it were not Plato speaking. Xenophon's Apology is a first-person narrative which cites as its source the account of one Hermogenes. A third difference is that Xenophon's account of Socrates' defense focuses on Xenophon's understanding that Socrates wanted to die, and thus was not conducting a proper defense. Xenophon's Apology opens this way. It seems to me fitting to hand down to memory, furthermore, how Socrates, on being indicted, deliberated on his defense and on his end. It is true that others have written about this, and that all of them have reproduced the loftiness of his words, a fact which proves that his utterance really was of the character intimated. But they have not shown clearly that he had now come to the conclusion that for him death was more to be desired than life, and hence his lofty utterance appears rather ill-considered. Xenophon goes on to recount that Socrates tried to prepare a defense, but couldn't, explaining, in Socrates' words, "I have already twice tried to meditate on my defense, but my divine sign interposes. Do you think it surprising that even God holds it better for me to die now? Do you not know that I would refuse to concede that any man has lived a better life than I have up till now? For I have realized that my whole life has been spent in righteousness toward God and man. But now, if my years are prolonged, I know that the frailties of old age will inevitably be realized. Perhaps God in His kindness is taking my part and securing me the opportunity of ending my life, not only in season, but also in the way that is easiest. For if I am condemned now, it will clearly be my privilege to suffer a death that is adjudged by those who have superintended this matter to be not only the easiest, but also the least irksome to one's friends, and one that implants in them the deepest feeling of loss for the dead." Xenophon's Socrates basically commits suicide rather than suffering martyrdom. Besides Plato and Xenophon, there were other literary followers of Socrates. Some wrote dialogues, others wrote apologies. Some were believed to have written speeches or reports of speeches defending Socrates against the charges made at his trial. Indeed, Socratic conversations became a well-known literary genre, which is mentioned by Aristotle, for instance, in his Poetics. The most important of these writers were Aeschines, Antisthenes, Aristippus, Euclides, and Phaedo, all of whom, except for the first one, founded Socratic schools. As Ray Chachi says, taken as a whole, the few writings that have survived from these five followers are consistent in their admonition, praise, and desire to emulate various aspects of Socrates' teaching. Their translations of his teaching, some of which were represented differently in the new schools of philosophy, others of which were perceived to be the master's words, which in turn provided different insights into his ethical views, reflect the fact that Socrates himself never wrote anything. Unlike Plato and Xenophon, however, these writings appear to have focused very little, if at all, on Socrates' personal and citizenship characteristics. Rather, for these writers, as for Aristotle, who also mentions Socrates briefly at several points, the name Socrates simply became associated with certain ideas. In short, the Socrates of Socratic conversation appears to be neither primarily a religious hero nor a gentleman. Rather, Socrates appears simply as a vehicle for propounding ideas, some of which the historical Socrates may have held, while others he may have not. In other words, Socrates became sort of a generic wise man whose aura could lend credibility to any idea at all, an idea which certainly must have sent Plato's Socrates spinning in his grave. Now, two things which all the Socratic literature I've been discussing so far have in common is this. First, they're all pro-Socrates in some way. And second, they all appear to have been written after Socrates' death. Not all Socratic literature had these characteristics. Indeed, it seems that the only works written during Socrates' lifetime, which feature him, do so in order to ridicule him. For instance, Socrates features in Aristophanes' Clouds, which was produced in 423 BC when Socrates was 46 years old. In this work, Socrates is portrayed as the worst kind of sophist in charge of a school called the Thinkery. Aristophanes' Socrates is a perverter of truth, a thief, and a parasite. It is this image that Plato's Socrates is at pains to dispel at the beginning of the Apology. In addition to the Clouds, Socrates appears in Aristophanes' Frogs, as well as in the works of four other comic poets. As Ray Chachi notes, in these comedies, Socrates is generally depicted as A, associated with sophists, or thought of as the sophist himself, B, capable of theft, be it stealing a coat or being accused of stealing a wine jug, C, incapable of providing enough food for his associates and followers, D, prone to solemn, lofty, grandiloquent speech, which on the whole is seen as nothing more than foolish displays or the chatter of a madman. In other words, during Socrates' lifetime, the Socrates that appeared in literature was pretty much a nut. The attacks on Socrates did not stop with his death, however. Around 393 BC, 6 years after Socrates' execution, a well-known sophist named Polycrates published a work entitled Accusation of Socrates, which presents itself as the speech delivered by one of Socrates' accusers, Anytus, at the trial. Indeed, many scholars suspect that it was the publication of this attack on Socrates, now lost to us, which spurred the production of the various apologies and dialogues, not least those of Plato and Xenophon. So to conclude now, let me see if I can summarize and synthesize some of these remarks to come to an understanding of Plato's apology. First and foremost, Plato's apology is exactly that, Plato's. Like all his dialogues, the apology is first, last, and always a product of its author. Whatever similarity there may be to persons or actual events living and dead is merely coincidental. For the audience of Plato's defense is not the same as the audience of Socrates' defense. By the time Plato wrote the apology, the trial was long over and Socrates long dead. The jurors had long gone home. Rather, Plato's presentation of Socrates' defense is addressed to a much wider audience. As Ray Chachi puts it, because Plato's portrait of Socrates is literary and the product of a fertile imagination, it fictionalizes its subject. Though he bases his characterization of Socrates on fact, Plato's literary genius produces a legendary mythic figure. From the point of view of his readers, then, Plato's Socrates represents qualities which were very remarkable in themselves. For those who are unable to attain them, Socrates becomes the exemplar of the life of philosophical inquiry and moral character. Ray goes on to conclude, in some ways, Plato's portrait of Socrates seems to suggest that Plato recognized there is something deep in our psychic natures that has a need to create mythic figures which are larger than life. In many ways, these mythical figures are meant to set standards which the average man, realizing that he will never achieve them, at least hopes that another will, and as such they are to be admired. It seems likely that Plato was aware that he was making a mythic character. Plato's representation of Socrates in the dialogues serves as a kind of model or beacon for others to follow. To sustain such an image of Socrates would require that Plato, at least in part, fictionalize and mythologize his subject. The mythic figure that Plato is creating is one that is to be emulated. Plato's Socrates sets standards for his readers and how they should live their lives. While I agree with Ray that Plato has created a legendary mythical Socrates, one who represents a standard for how we should or could live our lives, I think we can go further than this. So to return the questions I asked at the beginning, who the hell was Socrates and what did he think he was up to? And who the hell was Plato and what did he think he was up to? I'd like to take these in turn and begin with Socrates. I think it seems clear that Socrates actually did believe that he was on a divine mission to promote piety as he understood it, including the elements of virtue, justice, perfection of the soul, and an acknowledgement of human limitations, principally intellectual ones. Secondly, it seems that Socrates both attracted followers and offended many people in the course of this work. He had both disciples and critics like Aristophanes. And third, he appears to have been uncompromising in the pursuit of this mission, even to the point of being martyred at the end of his life. In this way, Socrates is much like the prophets that we see in the Hebrew Bible, who are urging the Israelites to repent, to follow God, to be just, to be ethical. They are all gadflies. Whether Socrates' understanding of himself was as well formulated or as the same as in the Apology is not really clear, which is where the question of Plato's self-understanding comes in. Plato appears to be at least the following things. First of all, he was the follower of a great man who never wrote anything himself. Thus, Plato, at least in part, envisioned himself as recording for posterity the words of his master. But Plato was also a great thinker in his own right, whose thoughts evolved over his own lifetime. Yet throughout his life, he continued to put everything into the mouth of Socrates, as if Socrates were the source of them. And thus today we have a problem trying to disentangle what thoughts really were Socrates and which were Plato's. But we can flip it around the other way and ask, why did he bother to put them all in Socrates' mouth in the first place? Thus the dialogues as we have them become an amalgam of the thought of two great men presented via the idealized portrayal of one of them, Socrates, and the complete absence of the other one, Plato. All we have is Socrates, no Plato. All subject and no author. Thus, in one way, we can compare the relationship between Plato and Socrates to another pair of great figures, that of Paul and Jesus. Another great man who never wrote anything down, with another great follower who developed his thoughts in a way that became famous. Indeed, if Paul was the first Christian, we might say that Plato was the first Socratic. In another way, with regard to the apology, I think we can make a different analogy. Plato was to Socrates in much the same way that a Mark or a Matthew was to Jesus, documenting the life of the master and creating a legendary and mythical figure that could be developed into one that could be followed. Like a gospel, the apology is meant not only to inform, but also to motivate the reader. The reader is meant to aspire to emulate this great figure, to aspire to a divine life. As George Anastopoulos puts it, the apology provides for the prospective philosophy a substitute for the demonic thing Socrates happened to have. Indeed, the demonic thing is transformed into the apology. We should not expect to hear of it again. Thank you.